Do we want to keep shooting ourselves in the foot, or are we here to make some damn money? I'm Ray Myers. Welcome to Craft versus Cruft. Today I'd like to show you a presentation I've been working on called Conflicts Don't Exist, the Evaporating Cloud Technique. And this is the second episode that I'm doing that's on the theory of constraints system. And we're going to cover one of the thinking processes. In fact, probably my favorite thinking process in the theory of constraints, which is the evaporating cloud technique, also known as the conflict resolution diagram. Starting it out with a pretty bold claim here that conflicts don't exist, but under the model of theory of constraints that Ellie Goldratt proposed, I believe that this truly holds, and this is a very useful tool to apply in your life and in your work. So let's get right into it. We're gonna talk about this problem solving technique. So it's helpful to frame what exactly is a problem. And from that definition, we are going to work to establish that point that we started with, that conflicts don't really exist. And that is going to enable us to find win-win solutions. We're going to actually show a formula for producing, almost a machine that cranks out win-win solutions. And that is the evaporating cloud. So then we're going to evaporate some clouds of our own to show how you can apply this, and then talk a little bit about how this is applied within the overall patterns of theory of constraints and some variations. So, what is a problem? According to Ellie Goldratt, as he presents it in Beyond the Goal, which you can find on Audible, and it's read in his own voice, which is really helpful to me. A problem is a conflict preventing the achievement of a goal. If it's something else, if it's just something you're upset about, then it's a complaint, it's a gripe. It's not actually a problem if it doesn't prevent the achievement of a goal. And of course, conflicts do not exist in reality. How could that be? What does that mean? Let's dive into it. How would a physicist interpret a conflict in reality? Let's say you weigh an item on two different scales. One of them says this is 3 pounds. The other says this is 5 pounds. What physicist would look at that situation and say, oh, well, let's compromise. It's actually 4 pounds because there's a conflict in reality, so we'll compromise. No, we're going to figure out why. We're going to find out why the scales are showing different readings, because either the weight is 4 pounds, or it's 3 pounds, or it's 5 pounds, or maybe it's none of these things. Maybe both of the scales are wrong, or maybe even our entire concept of weight is wrong. They will go to that length before they accept that a contradiction exists in reality. So why then, if we are trying to understand the truth about what is happening, will we accept that a conflict exists between two people that are trying to achieve the same goal and just say, let's compromise? So I will make you a solution you can't refuse. And in fact, Ellie Goldratt actually referred to the results of this technique as the Mafia Offer, representing the famous line about an offer you can't refuse by Don Corleone in the movie The Godfather. I don't suggest that you actually go around calling these things Mafia Offers, though. I think win-win solution is a lot clearer. The point being, merely a compromise, merely let's both give up some ground, is a lose-lose. Everyone's losing. But remember, there aren't conflicts in reality. The conflict never existed, so there is a win-win. We just have to find it. If we have one goal, we could not possibly be in conflict. We must just solve the riddle, this apparent contradiction. We need to figure out where it falls down, and then we can create a win-win solution. Is it not clear how to do that? Well, let's get to busting some clouds. Let's stare at this problem until we evaporate it with our mind. All conflicts share a common structure. Did you know that? All conflicts look like this. Is it not clear? Let's put some annotations on this. All conflicts look like this. it's not merely that there's some diagram you could draw with arrows and blocks and so forth, but it's this diagram every time. They are all some iteration of this diagram. So as these are notated, our goal is A. We all want to achieve A. A needs B. A also needs C. B needs D. C needs D prime. And we cannot have both D and D prime. They are in conflict. If all these things are true, something's got to give. We must give up some ground somewhere, and ultimately the goal compromises itself. But if any of these assumptions don't hold, then actually there is no conflict. If B didn't really need D, not absolutely, or if C didn't really need D prime, or so on and so forth, then actually there's a win-win. What does this look like? Let's look at an example. Many things are iterations of this common example. Our goal is to be happy, let's say, in life, right? And we need safety in order to be happy. Sounds reasonable. In order to be safe, we want to avoid change. Fairly typical. And in order to be happy, we also need to be satisfied, and we must change in order to be satisfied. So we must change, but we also must avoid change. And you cannot change and avoid change at the same time? Well, if that's all true, I guess we can never really be happy. Or at very best, there's a hard limit on how happy we can be while running into this contradiction. But is this really true? Does this conflict really exist? If we cut this dependency, if we cut this dependency, if we found out that this wasn't really true, well then, if that's true, then we don't have a conflict. We can be much more happy. We have a win-win. So let's write down all of the assumptions that are represented in these arrows. All of these arrows are assumptions. Again, the goal is to be happy. You could take it out right there and say that's not really the goal, but let's assume that it is. Being happy requires being secure. Being happy requires being satisfied. Being secure requires avoiding change. Being satisfied requires change. And changing is in conflict with avoiding change. Therefore, we can never be happy? Well, if these all hold, but do they? Do they? If we really stare at this until we can evaporate the cloud with our mind, and if we solve the riddle, will these all hold? I think you'll find that you could probably make a serious dent in several of these. Perhaps being secure doesn't require avoiding all change. Perhaps it just requires avoiding some kinds of changes or mitigating the risk we have. Perhaps that doesn't really hold. Perhaps being satisfied doesn't require change. Maybe there are aspects about our situation we could be more satisfied with. At the same time, maybe changing is not really in conflict with avoiding change, because maybe you can change in some ways and avoid other kinds of changes. So maybe you could avoid change and change at the same time. So really, what looked like this box that we were trapped in turns out, once we really analyze what assumptions led to the conflict, it doesn't really hold. So there's not that same constraint that prevents us from ever being happy. Was that one too easy? Let's try another. In software development, we would like to make customers happy. Now, we're often led to believe customers want new features. And so, therefore, we must work on a lot of features. But customers also want high quality, right? Customers don't like the blue screen of death. Customers gave it the name death. You do not want your product reminding customers of death. So clearly, to make them happy, we also need quality. And something that will help us do that is if we add more tests, but that is work as well. We can't add as many tests as possible and work on as many features as possible. So those two seem like they may be in contradiction. Those are competing for the same allocation of resources. So these things often fight. What can we do here? Are we trapped? Can we never truly make customers happy? Or very best, there's like this hard limit on how happy we can make customers based on the contradiction between working on features or adding more tests? Well, let's think about it. We've just written down all the assumptions here that led to that, and I think if you stare at this for a while and you're pretty up on modern software development practices, you might be able to find something we could knock down here. So if you'd like, you could pause the video and check up on that. I'm going to go ahead right now. So I call shenanigans on working on features as fast as possible is in conflict with writing more tests. I claim that based on what is now understood about the nature of test automation, that if it's applied well, if it's applied with skill, actually this is something that speeds up feature development. It makes us develop with more confidence. So actually we thought that these two investments, and we might have thought that due to various local incentives or what have you, these two investments were in contradiction with one another, but actually we can fulfill both at once. We can write more tests in support of delivering features more quickly, more consistently. And once we understand that, we will remove a cap on how happy we can make customers. Similarly, the customer wants us to respond to their needs, which means release more often. The customer also wants us to release safely because they don't want, again, the product breaking. They don't want the blue screen of death. And that would seem to imply that we release less often. But responding to needs implies we release more often. Well, in DevOps and SRE, we have developed the understanding that we can release safely by releasing more often because the safest change is the smallest change. So DevOps and SRE, when properly practiced, cut that assumption and remove again this cap, this needed compromise on how satisfied we can make our customers. So how do we apply this in reality? You've seen the formula. You really already have everything you need to try this. I would suggest making sure that all parties really have and understand the common objective. Like first principles, we're all trying to make the business more money now and in the future. But as local a goal that all parties involved legitimately have, start there and be sure everyone really is operating ultimately off a need to achieve that. Embrace all sides of this, right? Because again, this is to deal with a conflict between different parties who probably present it in different ways. So present everyone's view in the words they would. Having done that, surface hidden assumptions. The every line in the diagram is an assumption, but that itself may be justified by further assumptions. So you may have to kind of play root cause analysis on the assumptions, if you will, and just see this as a riddle. You must stare at it, this logic puzzle, until you figure out what falls down. So this can really be applied in practice anywhere you see a conflict between parties that ultimately are trying to serve a common goal, which should always be the case in a business, for instance, or other kinds of organization. Applied within the theory of constraints framework, you might have a situation where you've just applied what we saw in Herbie and the Goal, my previous video on theory of constraints, which talked about the 5 focusing steps of addressing a bottleneck. That often will surface some change that you may need to enact in order to address that bottleneck. And when you want to enact change, you will run into resistance. You'll run into conflict. So it's useful to have this kind of tool, this kind of thought process of a conflict resolution diagram to show how all parties really can win. So that's how we could apply it from a more patterns thinking approach. You also see it as part of various frameworks, including the logical thinking process by Detmer, which is kind of a repackaging and refinement of Goldratt's theory of constraints that has evaporating cloud as a particular step in the process. So you start with this goal tree, and then you go around and you figure out what's stopping you from achieving the goal. And when you discover what sort of conflict within the root cause analysis, which they call current reality tree, you create. When you find that conflict that is causing the issue, you use evaporating cloud as an explicit step here, and then find your win-win solution. Use these steps to implement it, and then you go around the circle, continuing to address things that are stopping you from achieving your goal and its various sub-objectives. And that's I think that's quite interesting, like assembling these different thinking processes into kind of a deterministic game you're always playing. You could also look into the original book called It's Not Luck, where the evaporating cloud was introduced. I'm particularly fond of Goldratt's Beyond the Goal, especially the version on Audible that's narrated by him, goes into kind of the deeper philosophies behind his various novels. And one more plug for the more recent The Phoenix Project, which of course is foundational to a lot of DevOps thinking, or crystallized a lot of the epiphanies that were being had. And there you have like a lot of core conflicts between developers and IT operations, being addressed in kind of a win-win. So very good practical applications that if you're in DevOps like myself, you would recognize as having permeated the industry. So I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you'd like to hear about next. If I do another on theory of constraints, I'd love to have someone on the channel from that community. I know some of them have been watching, so here's your bat signal. I'd love to have you on. As Lao Tzu said in the Tao Te Ching, with patience, the most tangled cord may be undone. Thank you.